Good afternoon, everybody. We've been having some technical difficulties, I'm afraid. The original speaker, Yogi Sokolingam, can't make it for technical reasons, so I'm stepping into the breach. I've got two different presentations I'd like to give you. One is the Kukurain-Hyundai genocide, and the other is self-determination human rights. So I'd like to present you just a few thoughts on, say, the Kukurain genocide that took place in Zimbabwe in the Matabeleland land area, which is in the western part of the country. I'm guessing that most people listening to this or seeing this probably know all about it, but of course around the world very few people know all about it. So let's look at genocide in general. There are a number of definitions given for genocide, but many people view it as the mass killings of a specific group. But for the first coiner of the word, Raphael Lemkin, who was a Polish lawyer in exile, genocide was defined as a coordinated strategy to destroy a group of people, a process that could be accomplished through total annihilation, as well as strategies that eliminate key elements of the group's basic existence, including language, culture, and economic infrastructure. Crucially, the International Criminal Court essentially agrees with this definition, which is embodied in the Rome Statute. Thus, it is the intent, regardless of the level of success of the strategy, that is crucial. Also, whilst a target group is usually racial, ethnic, religious or linguistic, cultural or national, it might also be political, such as in Cambodia in 1975 to 79 or Indonesia in 1965. No one disputes that genocide can and has taken place, but as will be discussed, there is a dispute over whether specific incidents constitute genocide. Is it important? Well, the international community is no longer on paper prepared to express a saligueur attitude towards genocide. Indeed, ex-President Bill Clinton stated that the biggest regret of his presidency was not acting decisively to stop the Rwandan genocide, and President Obama said it must never happen again. Needless to say, however, it has. A great deal of people, largely the average person and media, interpret genocide as mass extermination. In other words, the destruction or attempted destruction of a people. Raphael Lemkin, who lived in exile in the US from 1941, was the architect of the Convention of the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, adopted by the UN in 1948. The factors that deviate from the popular view of genocide is that it doesn't restrict it to the total destruction, but includes a destruction in part and includes a serious bodily or mental harm. Deaths itself need not be immediate or may not even come to pass, but rather creates the circumstances that do not support prolonged life, such as deliberate acts of deprivation, for example, the denial of substance. In more modern times, it will include cultural genocide. It does not necessarily have to be successful, a successful act or acts. In 1980, Zimbabwe came into being after a 15-year-old guerrilla war. In 1983, the Shona-dominated government under Mugabe sent in armed forces, particularly the North Korean trained 5th Brigade, into the minority area of Matabeleland, which is in the western part of that country. The result is known as the Kukurain-Hyundai, which in Shona means the early rain that washes against the chaff, which reflects their dismissive view of the Ndebele who live in that area. We shall never know how many were killed, tortured or displaced, but there are published figures of deaths between 3,750 to 80,000. Was it a genocide? To the average person, this may simply be seen as a single or interconnected case of mass murder rather than attempted genocide. In other words, a deliberate attempt at eliminating a whole or part of a population. Whatever the definition chosen, does it really matter? Well, firstly, most average people would regard genocide as something more serious than acts of murder or acts of human rights abuses. So if you get a particular act or actions agreed as a genocide, most people find that more offensive than obviously so-called lesser crimes against humanity. Secondly, in 2002, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide helped create the International Criminal Court. It used that particular act as a reason for existence. And this can try an individual or individuals if national courts are unwilling or unable to investigate, let alone prosecute genocide. They can try under its articles 5 categories of serious crimes. At the top, of course, is genocide. Then you go to crimes against humanity, war crimes, crimes of aggression, and offences against the administration of justice. The number of actual full-on investigations and prosecutions now run into double figures. Other genocides against national groups struggling for self-determination might be Tamil, East Timor, Bangladesh, Biafra, and perhaps the Uyghurs in China today. Going back to Zimbabwe, there were calls for Mugabe and our calls for President Emerson Mnangagwa to be taken to the ICC for actions up to today and right back to that original genocide in 1980. That is presently framed as crimes against humanity. But since the latter was, like Mugabe, in the government in the 1980s, perhaps he himself could be charged with genocide. One problem is that many countries are either not a signatory to the Rome Statute, which is the treaty which has actually established the court, or accept the court's jurisdiction, and that includes Zimbabwe, or are reluctant to use the ICC for various political reasons. Furthermore, many African leaders oppose the ICC since the first 9 out of 10 ICC investigations were located or about acts that took place in that continent. Whilst one could argue this was because other non-African countries were able to avoid investigation for geopolitical reasons, and the disproportionality could be a reflection of African weakness, such prosecutions ultimately offer the benefit of African citizens, because most of those genocides and certainly killings were perpetrated against other Africans. As for using the ICC to bring charges against Zimbabwe leaders, it will only occur post a new government, in my opinion. When that will occur, we can only speculate. In the meantime, it is important that you continue to highlight and spread the word that what happened in Matabeleland in the 1980s was indeed a genocide. That alone will attract interest in who and what is Matabeleland and why certain people wish to displace that particular ethnic and national group. That alone will attract interest in its own right, and it will further your ultimate goal of exercising your right to self-determination. Thank you on that first presentation. I'm going to bring up another presentation, if you forgive me, and that is self-determination and human rights. Now, although Matabeleland activists suffer from the Zimbabwe state, we know that they are not alone. There are around 150 nations around the world who have activists campaigning for self-determination, which effectively is some form of autonomy or independence from the state they presently reside. Some, like Scotland, openly campaign, stand in elections, and ultimately are able to have a referendum on their status, without fear at least of being attacked. Others, like the Matabele, but many others too, cannot openly campaign, and some, like the Matabele, are vulnerable to arrest, detention, or something far worse. But how can you break this cycle, or at least convince the international community of Matabeleland rights? Firstly, let us be clear, self-determination is a universal principle. In other words, a collective human rights. Now, human rights themselves are principles that set out certain standards of human behaviour. They're usually protected legally in national and international law. To quote, they are commonly understood as inalienable fundamental rights to which a person is inherently entitled simply because she or he is a human being. Human rights are seen as universal, in other words, applicable everywhere and egalitarian, the same for everyone. We all have an opinion in what this encompasses, and indeed one could argue that the Ten Commandments itself, for example, thou shalt not kill or steal, is based upon the premise that it would infringe upon somebody else's human rights. Where then is the position of self-determination within human rights? Is it indeed a human right? Self-determination is not a new principle or concept. It has been around a long time. National self-determination, in other words, the right of a people to determine who or how they rule themselves, was not described as such when peoples called for freedom from empires, be it Italians in Austria-Hungary or Colombia against Spain's, but it surely was. By and large, those early national self-determinists received little support and had to rely upon their own resources, or if they were lucky, a friendly state. The first changed after the First World War, when the US President Woodrow Wilson, in his famous 14-point speech to Congress on the 8th of January 1918, explained his belief in self-determination. This meant that each nation should have the power to self-govern and not be ruled by other nations. He elaborated this in a later speech to the US Congress to quote, "National aspirations must be respected. People may now be dominated and governed only by their own consent. Self-determination is not a mere phrase," Wilson told Congress. "It is an imperative principle of action, which statesmen will henceforth ignore at their peril." Although this belief impacted upon the League of Nations, which was formed just after the First World War, it came to the fore with the advent of the UN nations later. It talks about individual human rights in its founding charter, and various declarations thereafter. Crucially, it also talks about collective human rights, such as self-determination. In other words, self-determination is not an individual human right, but it cannot be exercised by individuals alone, but by groups only. I should say national self-determination. Yet, despite the printed word, in reality, the UN does not follow those declarations. It should really be known as the United States, as it's a club of states that largely protects existing borders. This is because, although it talks about self-determination, the UN also talks about territorial integrity. For example, in the above charter, the declarations of principles of international law concerning friendly relations and cooperation among states, it also says that nothing in the foregoing paragraph shall construed as authorising or encouraging any action which would dismember or impair, totally or in part, the territorial integrity or political unity of sovereign and independent states, conducting themselves in compliance with the principle of equal rights and self-determination principles. That, of course, is a bit of a mouthful, but nevertheless, governments use it. Of course, self-determinists would say that their governments do ignore their self-determination, but governments will still hide behind this get-out clause by pretending to represent all and deny there is distinction between peoples and their territory. To understand why states ignore self-determination in front of the UN, you have to look at the context of its foundation. The UN and the League of Nations before it was created by the victorious powers in both world wars. Their primary aim was to dismantle empires. The Central European empires after the First World War and those of the colonial powers after the Second, as the United States was interested in weakening economic competition and imperial trade preferences. Thus, the major powers were more concerned with removing the existing rulers and less concerned with what replaced it. In my opinion, territorial integrity is about the protection of borders from the design of neighbours. It is not, I contend, about keeping the same borders internally. However, most states are loath to surrender territory, even for peace, and use that principle to defend their actions, because the UN is a club of states, rather than nations per se. So in other words, it's not about nations, it's about states. And the existing states, they wish to maintain that status quo. And it chooses to ignore the UN itself chooses to ignore its own proclamations and bows to the state's interpretation of territorial integrity. So we're not going to find the UN or other international bodies such as the EU, Commonwealth, African Union, OAS or ASEAN readily supporting self-determination, as they too are a club of states. So where do we go from here? Well, within many countries, the opportunity to achieve self-determination will be nigh impossible. Lack of freedom, suppression and violence will prevent that goal, and the chances of an Arab Spring freeing the people is limited. difficult to organise, even less so from abroad. Many people will know this only too well, including Matabeles. Obviously, it will be easier to operate within Western societies, which will allow freedom of speech. In many senses, however, for most of the self-determinist causes around the world, the struggle has transferred from the homeland to the diaspora because, which means you have the freedom and the resources. Your target, therefore, will be everyone around you. However, as I explained, state leaders, even in the West, are reluctant to embrace self-determination. Thus, we must reach out to their people. We must fight a war of hearts and minds. In this way, we can apply pressure from below. We believe that the majority of individuals, greater still the more active members of society, would support and do support the principle of self-determination. The challenge is to link that principle to actual causes. But this requires a massive output of material, largely printed, but will involve film and social media. Beyond winning over hearts and minds, we also have to mobilise their minds to actually support self-determinist organisations in their own or secondary activity. And we do this through lobbying of politicians and the media to support the principle and specific causes. In the long run, we should aim to influence young or future politicians to support self-determination in their heart, whilst in the short run, we aim to apply pressure upon existing politicians to support self-determination in their own interest. This will involve using diaspora communities and, hopefully, a growing network of supporters to campaign against or in favour of targeted politicians. By not becoming a party itself, it leaves groups like Nations Without States, which I represent, freedom of action to create a dynamic tension between establishment parties and insurgent self-determinist ones. This could therefore be a third-party campaigning to affect elections. It could involve infiltrating parties to take part and to influence their activists, and it could be flexing self-determinist electoral muscles by parties that totally embrace the principle. We've also supported candidates in London in the European elections under the title National Liberal Party Self-Determination for All to promote the cause and offer an alternative. We shall be repeating that next year in the GLA elections, and hopefully Matabelans will help us in that struggle. The latter, for example, will involve mobilising all self-determinist diasporas throughout the globe, but particularly where they are concentrated and free, for example, in Paris, Rotterdam, London, etc., etc. So we have to remind the world about their supposed support for self-determination and lobby to make it happen. Ultimately, whether pressure is built from within or without a state, our public aim should be to call for a UN-supervised referendum within all countries holding down national peoples. It can work, and we in Nations Without States and other interested parties will try and make that happen for all oppressed peoples. Thank you.